Halo Infinite's campaign manages to feel simultaneously big and small. From a gameplay perspective, there's still a strong focus on the masterfully balanced combat the IP is known for, but there are now also open-world elements. When it comes to the epic space opera narrative, events feel stripped back, both in terms of the scope and how it's presented. I'm also still undecided if it's a point for or against the Halo Infinite campaign that, upon completion, I immediately reinstalled the Halo Master Chief Collection. Starting with the narrative, it's immediately obvious that 343 Industries wants a fresh start for the IP, and for potential newcomers to this console generation of Halo. Halo Infinite quickly sets about wrapping up lingering plot elements from the prior games, with surprisingly little fanfare. Where once you would experience crucial events firsthand, or at least get a flashy cutscene, Halo Infinite is content to tell rather than show, and you spend the entire game on a small fragment of the Zeta Halo installation. The amount of simple exposition dumps, dealing with the capture and defeat of Cortana, especially in the opening and closing hours of the campaign, feels absurd, given the high-stakes, galaxy-spanning narrative setup in Halo 4 and Halo 5 Guardians. Despite drawing on characters and events from the past games, and some cross-media content that only a tiny fraction of the fanbase consumes, the presence of the UNSC Infinity crew is reduced to scattered audio logs. The fate of the UNSC Spirit of Fire is ignored, despite John 117 encountering the same Banished faction they faced in Halo Wars 2, while you'll only discover the full extent of Cortana's actions against the organic races through in-game banter or cutscenes with holograms. So many holograms. Compared to the lavish cutscenes seen in the prior games, computer-generated or in an engine, Halo Infinite is lacking. Now, it's not all bad news if you accept the focus is no longer on the broader conflict, but the Chief's internal struggles. Highlights include his growing relationship with the Weapon, a new AI that was responsible for trapping and destroying Cortana, the Chief coming to accept Cortana's death and his failure to save her, and several interactions with the surviving pilot, which serve to remind him most of humanity are not highly trained Spartans, even if the more uplifting moments from these interactions feel overwritten and predictable. Halo Infinite kicks off after the remnants of the UNSC fleet establish orbit and commence with their plan to capture and delete Cortana. Mid-operation, a massive Banished fleet arrives and decimates the UNSC's forces in orbit. The Chief buys several teams time to evacuate, but ultimately loses to the brute chieftain, Atriox, before being tossed into the void for 6 months in stasis. Oh, none of this is playable if you're wondering. Pilot Echo 216 stumbles upon him among the ruins of the fleet and brings him out of suspension, in the hope of finding a way to flee. Naturally, the Chief aims to complete his mission instead. From that point on, the player gains control, and it's typical Halo fare, a fight against overwhelming odds to save humanity from both an old and a new threat, with the sort of rubbish odds that the Chief is used to. Unfortunately, the new villains feel underwhelming and lack complexity for the bulk of your playtime. A secondary plot arc follows the tired trope of introducing another terrible and unknown threat, supposedly even worse than the Flood, while the journey across Zeta Halo feels incredibly lonely, and not in a moody sense like the nighttime sections of Halo 3 ODST. The Banished faction leader, his right-hand Sanghaili, and several underlings that feature as sub-bosses are all one-note rambling sadists, until the writers try to make them more complex in the final hour. The Harbinger and her species have suffered some injustice in the past, so naturally she decides the best course of action is to destroy the Forerunner's descendants, humanity. Given the bulk of the plot feels so tired and cliched, the best moments were some frank or tense exchanges between the Chief and his new AI, which felt authentic and surprisingly heartfelt, considering the Chief's inability to communicate in full sentences, though there was perhaps too much foreshadowing for the eventual twist. Ultimately, one of the biggest problems with Halo Infinite's scaled-down narrative is the lack of pacing that comes with the introduction of several open-world gameplay segments. As a result, the campaign is at its best during the linear opening and closing missions, about 2-ish and 3-ish hours of gameplay respectively. These missions take place primarily in enclosed locations, like spaceships and Forerunner structures, but they're packed with frequent story beats, back-to-back combat arenas, and boss fights. They feel like classic Halo at its best. Sure, you'll spend too much time fighting through bland and symmetrical Forerunner structures, but these sections still offer great pacing, and they highlight what Halo has always done well: fast, tactical, and adaptive combat. As in all Halo games, every weapon and grenade type has a purpose, be that an optimal target, attack range, or a specific environment in which they excel, even if a few do feel too niche. Recharging shields, an ability shared by the chief, elite enemies and bosses, force you to commit to extended bouts of combat if you want to eliminate a dangerous target quickly. Low ammunition reserves prevent you from sticking to the same two-weapon combo, making scavenging and adapting during engagements vital. Priority targeting, to suppress snipers, stagger charging foes, or force enemies to drop grenades, is also essential. Melee attacks remain overpowered, but getting in close is risky, and you can often find yourself on the receiving end of a devastating blow. The powerful vehicles you can commandeer can devastate groups of enemies, but they also make you a bigger target and can be easily disabled with energy weapons. The best thing about Halo Infinite is there's no one-size-fits-all approach to combat, so it really grows stale. There are some new additions, of course, and they're simple but impactful. The grapple shot allows for added maneuverability around the battlefield, but it can also be used to pull you into melee range, snatch up weapons from the environment, or hijack a nearby vehicle. Throwable explosive barrels, a dated video game concept by this point, proves unexpectedly useful and fun in combat, and they can be grabbed by the grapple shot. They come in several variants, and basically function as on-the-fly traps, or grenade substitutes when you run out. The Sublime combat loop goes hand in hand with Halo's long-established and consistent difficulty levels. Easy offers up a power fantasy, giving you the option to charge into battle and emerge victorious 90% of the time. Normal requires some strategy, but it still allows you to mess up and escape from danger while your shields recharge. Heroic requires strategy and optimal weapon use, but allows you to come back from minor missteps, though the boss fights are particularly unforgiving. Legendary, on the other hand, allows for few mistakes. Entering a battle unprepared usually equals death, and jackal snipers exist to haunt your nightmares. I sometimes feel there'd be room for another difficulty wedged between normal and heroic, but you should be able to find a setting that provides a decent challenge, without creating combat roadblocks. But what of Halo Infinite's open-world elements? Generic icon-clearing activities like claiming forward operating bases, which function as fast travel and resupply points, dismantling Banished operations, and saving Marine squads for valor points, which in turn unlock new vehicles and Marine support, or hunting for Spartan cores, which allow you to marginally upgrade the Chief's abilities that you acquire from discovering other fallen Spartans. These systems are all interconnected, and provide moments of sandbox-style entertainment, with new equipment creating the potential for new tactical opportunities. However, despite Halo Infinite's relative constraint compared to true open-world games, these segments offer rapidly diminishing returns, drag down the narrative pacing during the mid-game, and they often don't gel well with the checkpoint and save system. Once you've unlocked several FOB supply drops, think armored warthogs, rocket launcher marines, the Scorpion tank, and eventually a Wasp light aircraft, they do provide enjoyable and efficient ways to complete other open-world objectives. The grapple shot also makes plenty of sense in these open spaces, and is ideal for hijacking vehicles. Ramping into the middle of an FOB, with an armored warthog packing 5 marines, was always a highlight when they swiftly wiped out the opposition, without me firing a shot. Similarly, taking out high-value targets in a Scorpion tank or Wasp aircraft was simultaneously empowering and somewhat cheap. Most enemy units struggle to respond at long engagement ranges, and I can understand why boss battles lock you into small arenas. Unfortunately, you'll also notice several glaring issues during these open-world segments. The most obvious is the lack of co-op play at launch, despite clear evidence certain locations and vehicles are designed to support up to 4 players. Another issue is the vast but empty map, in which you'll spend far too much time running, grappling, or driving through respawning mobs of Banished on the way to distant points of interest. Now I could tolerate all these issues, but what was considerably less forgivable is the way the game handles checkpoints during optional activities, or even primary missions that take place in the open world. Halo Infinite frequently checkpoints as you progress, even in the middle of combat encounters so long as your health and shields are full. This led to reloads that dropped me right as I was about to be hit by a massive vehicle or boss attack, leading to massive damage, the stripping of my shields, and potentially unwinnable loops. Other times, I'd trek for several minutes from an FOB to engage a high-value target, die in combat, only to reload back at the distant FOB. Falling back on a progress save, typically triggered after completing a listed sub-objective, proved just as frustrating when the game routinely respawned enemy waves I had defeated to get to the objective in the first place. Sure, Halo Infinite had no game-breaking issues that prevented completion, but I quickly grew tired of the inconsistency when tackling open-world missions. Now, if there was one element offsetting these uninspired open-world activities, it was the impressive audiovisual experience when tearing across Zeta Halo, even when playing on a budget Xbox Series S. Now, Halo always had distinctive designs, from the Chief's armor, to the UNSC and alien weapons and vehicles, to the strangely serene yet unsettling artificial Halo environments. Now, Halo Infinite is clearly a cross-generation project, but I'd recommend a modern PC or current-gen console, if only for the 60 FPS gameplay option and super fast loading times. Backing the visuals is another amazing soundtrack, and some quality voice acting, at least for the Chief and the weapon. The presentation may not convince you needed to buy a new console or GPU, but it's still an impressively well-rounded package. I'd even argue the occasionally wonky ragdoll physics and impact animations are an entertaining highlight, especially when the Chief goes hurtling into the void T-posing, rather than a mark against the presentation. What is disappointing, however, is the uninspired cutscene direction. Most of these are just various cuts between the Chief, his allies, or the villains in conversation. Everything important or dramatic seems to happen before the Chief arrives, and it makes for bland viewing. Now, even with those negatives accounted for, I still enjoyed the bulk of my time with Halo Infinite, especially when it channeled the spirit of the classic games. I'd estimate around 40% of my 20-hour playthrough was spent on the most significant open-world activities. Think capturing FOBs, saving Marine squads, and dismantling Banished operations. But these activities quickly grew tedious, and pushed me to move on with the main story. Now, I've seen an unfortunate amount of positivity towards these open-world elements, as a further boost the aging IP needs. However, in its current form, it's difficult to agree. The Halo games have always provided overly dramatic space operas that took you through a diverse range of locations. Limiting the game to a single location, no matter how large and packed with activities, leaves the experience feeling shallow and limited in scope. It may be the largest Halo game yet, but it feels like the least ambitious. Other Halo games that are focused on a single location, think Halo 1, Halo 3 ODST, and Halo Reach, all managed to feel more diverse and epic. I just hope that 343 Industries has several narrative expansions in the works, focused on either fleshing out other characters and events only mentioned in passing, or providing the Chief with new and diverse locations to battle through.